In the summer of 332 BC, a 24-year-old king stood on a beach and stared at something no army in the ancient world had ever conquered. An island. Half a mile of open water separated him from a city that had never fallen. Not once, in over 2,000 years. The people inside believed their god had built their walls himself. They were about to find out that belief was not the same as safety. His name was Alexander, and by this point in his campaign he had already broken the Persian army at Issus and marched down the coast almost unopposed. City after city had opened its gates to him. Some out of fear, some out of calculation, some simply because resistance had already proven pointless elsewhere. He didn't strictly need Tyre. He could have marched past it toward Egypt and left it standing at his back. But Alexander understood something his enemies consistently failed to grasp. Leave one fortress standing behind you, especially a fortress with a fleet, and it becomes a knife pointed at your spine. A base the Persian navy could use to strike his supply lines while he was fighting 1,000 miles away. He sent envoys to the island with a request that sounded almost courteous. "Allow me to sacrifice to Heracles in your temple," since the Tyrians themselves claimed their city's founding god and the Greek hero were one and the same. It sounded like a religious formality. It was actually a test of submission, and everyone on that island council understood exactly what he was really asking. The Tyrians said no, and they didn't say it politely. Confident behind walls that rose over 150 feet from the water on some sides, protected by a natural moat no siege engine had ever crossed, they killed Alexander's messengers and threw their bodies from the ramparts into the sea, where his men on the shore could watch them fall. It was a calculated message, not a moment of panic. This city had endured Assyrian sieges, survived a prolonged Babylonian siege under Nebuchadnezzar that had lasted 13 years without ever breaking through, and shrugged off every threat the mainland had thrown at it for over 2 millennia. The Tyrians didn't just believe the water was their wall. They had centuries of proof. So Alexander made a decision that his own generals reportedly thought was closer to madness than strategy. If the sea was the obstacle, he would not go around it, and he would not wait it out. He would remove it entirely. He ordered his army to build a causeway, a solid land bridge roughly half a mile long, driven straight through open Mediterranean water, timber and rubble piled directly into the sea, foot by foot, until dry ground reached all the way to the island's gates. No army in the historical record had attempted anything on this scale before. His engineers had built ramps against hillside cities. They had never tried to build a road across open ocean toward a fortress designed specifically to make that impossible. Work began almost immediately, and for the first stretch, it actually worked better than anyone expected. Engineers drove enormous wooden piles into the shallow seabed close to shore, packing the gaps between them with rubble torn straight from the ruins of the long-abandoned mainland settlement known as Old Tyre. Stone that had, ironically, once belonged to the same people now defending the island. Thousands of Macedonian soldiers, men trained for battle rather than labor, became quarrymen, haulers, and dock workers almost overnight, dragging stone and timber under a brutal Levantine sun that reportedly caused as many casualties in the early weeks as any Tyrian arrow. The mole crept forward, meter by exhausting meter, and for the first time since the envoys were killed, the Tyrians watching from their walls stopped laughing at the mainland king's impossible project. Then the seabed dropped away. As the causeway pushed into deeper water near the island, the structure grew narrower, more exposed, and dangerously within range of Tyrian archers, catapults, and slingers stationed along the walls. The Tyrians didn't sit back and wait for the mole to finish reaching them. They took the fight to it directly. Warships harassed the exposed workers from both flanks, and eventually a converted horse transport ship packed with pitch, dry brushwood, sulfur, and cauldrons of flammable material was towed out under cover and deliberately rammed into the causeway's vulnerable tip before being set ablaze. The fire spread fast along timber that had taken weeks to lay. Alexander's men could only watch as the structure collapsed into fire, smoke, and steam in a single catastrophic afternoon, undoing what had felt, days earlier, like inevitable victory. It should reasonably have ended there. Plenty of ancient commanders, faced with the same setback, the same loss of morale, and the same mounting casualties, would have withdrawn and looked for an easier target elsewhere. Alexander didn't. He ordered the causeway rebuilt, this time wider to reduce how exposed the working face was to incoming fire, and reinforced with protective towers of his own design to shield the laborers as they worked. He brought in engineers and specialized siege equipment gathered from across his rapidly expanding conquered territories. Critically, he also requisitioned entire fleets from Phoenician and Cypriot cities that had, until very recently, been allied with Persia. Cities that, after watching what happened to Tyre's messengers and hearing what kind of siege Alexander was now committed to, decided very quickly that switching sides was the more survivable option. Almost overnight, Alexander went from having no navy at all to commanding roughly 200 warships, enough to finally challenge Tyre's own formidable fleet directly and seal the island off from resupply or reinforcement by sea. With the causeway rebuilding and the sea now blockaded, the rebuilt mole finally reached close enough to the walls to bring the true siege equipment into play. And this is the part the history books remember most vividly. Siege towers taller than any built before, some reportedly rivaling the height of the walls themselves, floating batteries mounted on pairs of ships lashed together to stabilize battering rams and catapults on open water, an engineering solution nobody had needed to invent until this exact siege demanded it. The Tyrians met every innovation with one of their own. They poured heated sand down onto attacking soldiers, sand hot enough to work its way beneath armor and burn skin no blade could reach. They swung massive grappling hooks and cranes to snag attackers directly off the siege towers and drop them into the sea. They sent divers out under cover of darkness to quietly cut the anchor lines of Alexander's ships, letting the current drag his own siege vessels helplessly out of position by morning. For 7 grinding months, this exchange continued, escalation matched by escalation, with neither side willing to concede that the other might actually win. Alexander himself was reportedly struck and wounded during the fighting on more than one occasion, refusing each time to withdraw from the front lines his men could see him standing on. Omens and portents were said to circulate through both camps. A rumor spread that the Tyrians had taken the statue of their patron god and physically chained it to its pedestal, fearing it might abandon the city the way its favor seemed to be abandoning them. Whether or not the story was true, it captures how close to the edge the city's confidence had worn. Then, finally, in the summer of the following year, a breach opened in the southern wall near the harbor, battered through after months of relentless pressure from both the mole and the naval assault working in tandem. Alexander led the final assault through that breach personally, refusing to send others in first. What followed was brutal even by the standards of ancient siege warfare. The fighting spilled out of the breach and into the narrow streets beyond. House to house, and the city that had turned away every army for over 2,000 years fell within a single day. Alexander had accomplished something no king before him had managed, not the Assyrians, not Nebuchadnezzar himself, despite 13 years of trying. He had taken the island. The cost of Tyre's defiance was severe, and word of exactly how the siege had ended spread fast along every coastline in the region, reaching cities that had not yet decided how they would respond to the young king marching toward Egypt. Alexander hadn't just won a siege that had cost him 7 months and untold resources. He had permanently dismantled the idea that geography alone could guarantee safety from him. He proved that given enough patience, enough engineering, and enough sheer refusal to accept defeat, even the open sea could be turned into solid ground beneath an army's feet. And in a strange twist that outlasted every king involved, the causeway he forced into existence never washed away after the fighting ended. Sediment gathered against it steadily over the following centuries, widening and stabilizing what Alexander's soldiers had built under fire, until the half-mile bridge born out of one siege permanently reshaped the coastline itself. To this day, more than 2,000 years later, Tyre sits not on an island, but on a peninsula. A piece of geography rewritten, quite literally, by one young king's refusal to accept that something was impossible.